I live in London now, and I've lived here for 10 years, but I grew up in the Cotswolds in Gloucestershire. I grew up with my mum and my three siblings. My mum is white, and me and my siblings have the same parents, so we're all mixed, half black, half white. It was quite a strange place. It was really stratified by class, so you had really posh people living in the kind of the nice part and the nice houses. Then you had slightly smaller or slightly not as nice houses halfway up the hill for the middle class people or the aspirational people, and then you had right on top of the hill in the wind all of the poor people in the pebble dash houses. It got kind of a reputation, this village, for being some sort of bad land, which is kind of absurd when you think about the Cotswolds and you have this image of the kind of these nice rolling hills and these pleasant villages and stuff like that, and I think so, to an extent that was quite absurd for it to have this reputation, but in another way less so, because I think people were really poor and really had not very good access to resources or education or even had cars to get out of the village, and so it was quite a difficult place to live, and our house was a bit of a haven for a lot of the kids who live nearby. And my mum ran a preschool and ran a lot of stuff for young people and would take us on camping trips in the summer and stuff like that. So it was an interesting place to grow up, and I think as brown people in a very white environment, it was quite a nice place to grow up because most people's lives hadn't really gone to plan. I was homeschooled, and I think that was in large part because Mum was aware that we would be in really white schools and felt like there was a big chance that we would be not given the education that we deserve because there'd be assumptions about us not being able to achieve, or assumptions made about our behaviour and things like that that actually would be really unhelpful. And she was a teacher. Yeah, so she enjoyed homeschooling us, and that meant that we'd go on a lot of trips, a lot of little adventures. It was very informal. We'd spend a lot of time walking around the fields, figuring out ways to measure how tall trees were. I remember once we drew all the way down the road the outline of a blue whale to see how big they were and things like that. And I think, so my experience of being homeschooled is really situated in a rural environment because of the space that we were able to enjoy and explore, and how free we were all day, every day, to just go out by ourselves. I remember once she woke us up at 5 o'clock in the morning because she'd been walking and seen fox cubs and made us all get up and go and try and find these fox cubs and look at them. And that was what my education was like growing up.
My name's Becca. I live in Bridport. I would define my ethnicity as white and black Caribbean. I was born in St George's Hospital in Tooting, and my mum's English and my father's Jamaican. My father's parents came over from Jamaica in the 50s. I didn't have a relationship with my father until I was 14, and so that had a big part to play in a sort of lost identity that I felt during my childhood, because I didn't know my father and I didn't know his family, and therefore I didn't know part of me, basically. But ever since meeting my father and meeting my grandma and my auntie and my uncle, it's definitely had a more positive role on my sense of identity and feeling more at ease, being in the skin that I'm in. My experience as being a minority in a predominantly white rural area is a tough one. I've got a lot of experiences, a lot of memories of racism as a child. We moved from Tooting to Bridport when I was about 2 years old, so Bridport's my hometown, basically. And it was difficult. I was always different. With being that I had black skin, and I was probably one of maybe 4 black children in the whole school, and so I faced a lot of racism. Some examples of this would be, I remember there was a World Cup on one year, and England was playing in the World Cup, and I'd had an England t-shirt on. I'd gone to school in this England t-shirt ready to watch the game, and somebody told me that I couldn't wear the England t-shirt to school because I wasn't really English. Another example, when I was younger, I went over to a friend's house. I didn't even make it through the door, basically. I don't know if it was his father or his uncle, said that I wasn't allowed in the house. And I wasn't sure why, being that I was so young, I wasn't accustomed to racism at this point. He said that I couldn't come in the house, and I sort of accepted it and didn't think anything of it. And it wasn't until a week or so later, when my friend's sister came up to me and apologised, that I realised that I wasn't allowed in the house because I was black. Yeah, experiences like this were very common growing up, and to this day I wouldn't say that I face maybe such overt racism as I did as a child, but there's definitely that feeling of isolation, as I am still one of few black people in Bridport.
The towns or like the places that I have lived in Cornwall have insinuated that there's something like wrong with me. I was maybe like 11 or 12, and I was walking back from the shop that's like around the corner, and I felt like something hard hit my head, and it was like pebbles, and there was this middle-aged couple like throwing actual stones at me, and I was like, why are they doing that? So obviously I just like carried on walking. And then they started like shouting "Packy." It's actually really upsetting. I think recently, when you're older and like you've developed resistance to this like racism, it doesn't affect you as much. You're just like, oh, you know, another incident, but really it shouldn't be like that. And I know when I was younger, it really did impact my self-growth and just developing as like a normal kid, teenager should. Because you've got people like in the street giving you dirty looks, and you're like, well, why? And then you're like, oh, it's not happening to any of my other friends. It's only happening to, you know, me, or me and this other person, or me and my brother, who are of like minority ethnic groups. I've had like a moment where I was like maybe like 13, 14-ish, and I just sat like crying on my floor to my mum, and I was like, I don't know who I am. You know, not because I didn't know who I was as a person, like with my hobbies and stuff, but because I literally couldn't identify my physical looks with any other like group in a rural area. It kind of makes you feel as if you're all white, or you're all black, or you're all Egyptian, or you're all British.